Well, I was going to say I could make a short story really long, and sort of in a convoluted way. I think how I ended up going to, basically between the third grade and the 12th grade, uh, going to high school, going to elementary school, basically growing up outside Victoria. It's not even the Vancouver Island of Victoria. It was on the outskirts of six miles out of Victoria in a place called Colwood. So now it's really developed. It's been part of again the development of Colwood Langford as this kind of sprawling, huge, dense, and people living there and moving out there, and it's the place where our former premier, the sort of great John Horgan, came out of Langford and that area. When I was there growing up in the 1970s and 80s, it was a very small place. And that's really because my father was a mining engineer. I grew up in small places around BC. I went to the first grade and kindergarten in Hope, BC. Because why? Because there was a mine, the giant Mascot mine, was outside there, and he was one of the mining engineers trying to figure out where to put the next seam, or the next tunnel to follow what seam of iron or nickel or whichever they were looking for. And so I think that was my experience growing up, was of small town BC. And my great grandfather had come here in the 1880s, and he brought his 4 sons, my grandfather and his 3 brothers. But I'm also sort of a second generation, I guess is the term. My parents were first generation. They came here in 1965. I was born in 1967. So I was born in Canada, but it's something that actually, if you were Chinese here in what is now British Columbia, you weren't welcome. You were one of the excluded, or there was lots of attempts to exclude you, or to create a kind of a sense of non-belonging. And so you could say that's what shaped my upbringing in ways that I don't think as a 7-year-old or 8-year-old you can understand very clearly. But I knew that history because obviously I was very close to relatives, my grandparents, for instance. When my parents came, as I said, my dad had to work in small towns, and being in places like Colwood and Hope, BC, and it was a way of understanding the history of a kind of a rural British Columbia that had shaped my ancestors too. Those Chinese who came, the majority of them were working in industries as laborers all around the province, and as migrant laborers. So they would be, harvesting, if that was what the season was harvest season or planting season. They would work in logging camps, they would work in mines, they would work in all these kinds of things that were highly migratory, because that's where you could say their labor was needed. And so I got an appreciation for that through actually my father, working as a mining engineer in the small towns where mines are. And so that's, I was born in Vancouver General Hospital. And as a sort of side note, I was one of the Chung babies. There was a OBGYN, Madeline Chung, Dr. Madeline, who delivered, literally thousands of babies whose mothers were Chinese, because she was the only OBGYN for decades who could speak Chinese. So anytime a mother came in to VGH who was Chinese, they would call her. It didn't matter that she was already off. They would, page her, and then she would come in. So she literally has a list of every baby. And so there's a bunch of these people who are Chinese Canadian who were born VGH, and they're Chung babies. And so I'm one of those Chung babies. So that is a way of also understanding the kind of exclusion of Chinese from the professions. She was the only doctor who was Chinese Canadian, because the way that Chinese exclusion operated and was through disenfranchisement. It meant that when British Columbia as a colony joined the Dominion in 1871, one of the first acts of this new provincial legislature was to disenfranchise, to take the vote away from Indigenous people. Natives and Chinese was this really first foundational law. And then you could say our version of what South Africans would call apartheid was invented here. It was have disenfranchisement be the root of exclusion. So if you could not vote, then you could not basically join, you couldn't be a member of the bar. You couldn't become a lawyer who could argue cases in front of the judge. And so there's all these ways in which that shaped my life. So you could say I grew up in that. I was fortunate enough to make it to university, and to have lots of people want me to be a relatives go, well, you seem to get good grades. Are you going to be a doctor? Are you going to be an engineer? Are you going to be I didn't like blood. My dad was an engineer. I didn't particularly want to be an engineer. Accountant. I wasn't that good at math that I was going to be a good accountant. And so the default was go be a lawyer. And so when I was at UBC, that was the idea. I took lots of classes that were interesting to me, and I was just learning whatever I could. But in the end, it was like, how are you going to make a living? Well, if you don't want to be a doctor or an engineer or an accountant, then I guess I'll be a lawyer. And I was all set to go to law school when one of the professors that I really admired and respected said, why don't you seem to like history, you seem to like writing about it, why don't you apply to grad school? And I kind of went, no, I'm going to be a lawyer. And he kind of said, well, law school won't change. Why don't you, just here's a list of schools to apply to. And so I applied, ended up getting into a place I didn't even know what it was. It was Princeton, and I just thought of Princeton as a small town in BC. I sort of stayed, finished my master's, and then found something that I cared about, which was to really study migration of Chinese and other Asian migrants, and why they were looked down upon, as well as excluded, as well as denigrated. And so this problem of anti-Asian racism, you could say, became the subject of my research. And that was shaped, obviously, by not just my upbringing, but actually the generations of people who had come before me, my great-grandfather, grandfather. So it was also a way of understanding them.